Let's get oral. Let's get oral.
Hello. It's Camille from Let's Get Oral. We're here again, and I'm with my favorite co-host, Jonathan. Hey, Jonathan. And today, we're taking on Fluoride Part 2 with our other friend and colleague, Craig Harvey, who has been a toxicologist for well over 10 years in the space of oral care, personal care, medical devices, and food, with, of course, a PhD. And we invited him on to talk about fluoride because it's such a hot topic. And I think that the best person to talk about this space is really a toxicologist to help us understand kind of our threshold of using this fluoride in a healthy way, if that's possible, and then where we should be leery or where we should worry. So, Craig, thank you for coming.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Camille. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jonathan, are you excited to go over this again?
As always, again, I think we're going to be talking about fluoride a bit over the coming weeks, months, dare I say years. And while I can get nerdy with the chemistry, if people are interested, I think we're better suited having Craig walk us through. And Craig, I'm going to apologize ahead of time if I bring in any Friday puns.
No worries.
Because I'm sure you get that all the time. You ain't got to lie, Craig.
Yes. I was going to say the best part is getting it, and because you go to a restaurant and they're like, "What's your name?" and you give the order your name, and then somebody approaches you and says exactly that. You ain't got to lie, Craig, and you just look blankly at them because you're just like, "What are we talking about here?" Here's your order.
Yep.
So sometimes I do use a pen name at the Starbucks just for that reason, depending how I feel.
I understand.
That's hysterical. I never even thought that.
I love it.
Well, I wanted to kind of give a synopsis of what we covered last time, just to kind of set the stage. So we reviewed what fluoride is, kind of the discovery process of how it was starting to be utilized in oral care in the 50s, and some of that kind of pivotal foundation in Montana, and then the safety studies that came out afterwards. And then the idea of water fluoridation being always kind of criticized by some, and some more recent studies showing that maybe we should rethink our holistic fluoridation approach. And I covered the basics of kind of researching in this area, talking about the usefulness of epidemiological studies, but that they're only correlative, and you really have to kind of come back to clinical science to really evaluate those issues that are potentially coming up in these larger studies. And then the flaws of cell-based assays. And I talk about that because you can use something like toothpaste in a cell-based assay and it'll just kill everything. But depending on what kind of cells, and as you build and make it more complicated, it starts to be durable enough to handle things like toothpaste. And so they give us some clues as to what might be happening. But again, we need a systems approach in a body to help us understand these pieces. But I think in totality, the most damning study was really the pregnancy study, where pregnant women, their urine was evaluated for fluoride levels, and then their children were followed for several years to show that there was impact neurologically to those kids. So I think that definitely being cautious around fluoride exposure for pregnancy is something that we should keep our eyes on. But walk us through your kind of history with fluoride as a toxicologist and some of the things that come up for you with this chemical.
So thank you for that really great recap. So my history with fluoride has mostly been from a professional standpoint. I worked at a toothpaste company, and fluoride was one of the main ingredients they used as the active to show results for, or make the claims that they were actually cleaning your teeth. So As a toxicologist, I'm always of the opinion that, I follow that old adage that everything can be a poison. It's just about the dose. And so we always kind of have to assess what's the risk benefit, right? So if someone came up to me and said, hey, fluoride is bad for you, and I'd say, okay, really, why do you think that? Well, because X was shown to cause drop in IQ, or X was shown to affect bone cells, or X was shown to think. I'd say, well, how much did they use? Because I think, like you just described with the in vitro models, depending upon how much you use and depending upon what the system is, you're going to see dramatically different results, right? If I put the scientific term, am I allowed to curse here? I
Sure.
guess I should ask.
I don't know that we have explicit on our, but I don't think that I've held back.
I'll make sure to put that explicit tag on this episode,
No,
Craig.
I just want to make sure in case I slipped out.
No, you're
But
good.
if we put a huge amount of chemicals in a cell system, you definitely see an effect, either death or some alteration of the normal physiology. Now, there's two things I always think about when that comes up. One, well, yes, if you put something directly on a cell, you're going to see it, but how likely is that material actually to make it to the cell? And how likely is it to make it to the cell at the amount you put on? And that's generally where we run into a lot of issues, where we try to make, at least in a non-clinical kind of world where we're in now, where we try to make assumptions based on cell cultures and move it into real life exposures, right? As a risk assessor and a toxicologist, those are kind of the big things we look at, right? We look at applied dose. So how much is someone actually consuming, absorbing, or applying to themselves versus the true dose, like how much is actually getting into their body, right? So if I'm eating an apple, I may get a certain amount of formaldehyde from it just because there's a presence of formaldehyde in the seeds and everything else. However, how much is actually getting into the body, how much is being absorbed, how much is being metabolized, how much is being distributed, and how much is being eliminated, right? As a toxicologist, we also have from an oral consumption or oral exposure, we also have what we call first pass principles. So 60% of what you actually consume orally is not going to go into circulation. It's just going to go straight to the liver and just be like extruded out. And so when I think of fluoride, that's something that we also have to consider, right?
I want to stop you there.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to stop you there because we did talk momentarily about metabolism. I was surprised to hear or see that the studies showing fluoride uptake were like 90% efficient at getting to the bones and the enamel, which is extraordinary. So I wouldn't expect, even with first pass, that many tissues would be involved other than those with calcium.
Yes, that's a good point. Calcium is a key. There's other cofactors that affect what the fluoride absorption is. I mean, we all understand homeostasis, right? Our bodies tend to want to continue doing what they're doing. And that comes into play when we add chemical contaminants like fluoride or any kind of chemicals, right? There's a certain threshold where it's okay, or there's no effect, or there's an effect, or there's maybe an adverse effect, right? And we often graph these things out when we do our dose response curve to understand what the toxicity is. We want to find out if we're using something where we actually see something. So if you follow sport, you oftentimes see people get caught using PEDs, right? And they often say, well, it was from a tainted piece of meat I had, or my masseuse had it on his hand and he rubbed it on me and it was unintentional, consumption. And when they look at the actual numbers, a lot of times it's so small that you go, hey, that couldn't have done anything. It's not an effective dose. That could not provide any kind of competitive advantage, right? But that's how we see things, at least chemically, very much in the modern ages. If something's there, it must have done something, right? Which is why when you hear people say, oh, there's lead in my chocolate, or there's lead in my toothpaste, something that came out today, right? You go, well, Yeah, but how much lead is it? But it doesn't matter because people hear and they're instantly like, I'm never using that again. It did X. And that's just because we, as a kind of a society, are very much into a hazard specific kind of identification with chemicals. We instantly hear a chemical's name and we think, oh, bad. So whatever it does bad, it instantly does that, no matter how much. Even if it's, one molecule, which is an incorrect way to think things. But it's just how our minds works as humans right now, right? We're very binary, good, bad.
Agreed. Yeah. I wanted to bring up, I was looking at an animal study, so this is in mice, and they were saying, oh, fluoride actually affects neutrophils. And, me and neutrophils, I can't walk away from that title. And so I dig in, and of course, the dose that they have provided these mice is per kilogram of weight, way more than our daily exposure with fluoridated water, with a fluoride toothpaste, and all the other potential ways we could possibly be exposed to fluoride. Like, it was just an outrageous, unreasonable amount. And so, of course, we would expect all sorts of wild interactions. But to your point, that dosing is a really important part of that story, and external exposures, whether they be accidental or, how exactly impactful. And further, when I did talk about epidemiological studies, I also talked about the fact that many of the places that have fluoride endemic to those regions are also socioeconomically challenged. They're also poor nutrition. There's other contaminants in the area. So we can't just blame it on fluoride potentially. So all of those kind of pieces apply to what I think you're trying to say right now.
And I think that's a great point because it hits on the population, right? Like you said, is the population specifically already dealing with other cofactors that may increase the magnitude of effect, right? We, as toxicologists, we always talk about, we would love to understand mixtures better, right? We would understand if there's a synergistic effect, if there's a potentation effect. We talked about how calcium can affect the uptake of fluoride, right? Like if you're calcium deficient, your body's going to be like, oh, fluoride looks close enough, let's bring that on, right? So understanding that is key, but it's never one thing. And that's kind of the difficulty we're still trying to, as scientists and as toxicologists in general, try to understand, right? Because right now with the studies we do, we find the studies say fluoride at a certain level is safe. There's many years of data, but do we know that if we had combined studies with other things, does that change the safety profile? We're still trying to understand that, right? Because there are special populations that obviously are going to be more sensitive. Children, obviously, older people,
Pregnant women.
potentially pregnant women. I was trying to avoid that one, but sure. Just because it's like it's the third rail, you don't ever want to endanger pregnant women. I mean, it really is the third rail of any risk assessment, right? But again, so many changes going on in a pregnant woman. Does that affect the metabolism of the body? Does that affect flow through to the placenta, to the baby? Is it more damaging to the mother or to the fetus or the future child? There's a lot of questions around that. So yes. I mean, it's hard to define what exactly is the real risk. Are we at risk levels, right? And I think we're going to kind of comb through some of that later in the pod. If the idea is that fluoride is a neurotoxicant, well, sure. But so is water, Anything can be very bad for you. It just depends what the dose is. And sometimes we have to dig down past our initial chemophobia to say, no, it's okay. It's fine at this level. Or actually, the benefit outweighs the risk, as I say in my wabbity voice.
Adorable. I love it. Have you been following the controversial lawsuit that was going on with the EPA in California?
No.
No.
Why did you give me the background?
The heart of it is that the cumulative studies that have come out, they're basically saying that there's an impact to the brain and that kids are specifically affected and that the compound itself needs to be reevaluated for water supply. And I think to your point on, making sure that our pregnant women is kind of a priority to create a safer environment for them, I think that, just based on that alone is probably enough to want to backtrack on water fluoridation. But, the EPA has holistically and historically come back to your other point of dose is so small. But as we've seen in some of the other data coming out from the water supply and how it gets put forward, is those doses can vary pretty widely, even though there is a very controlled ideal. It doesn't always stay in that very fixed range. And so there is enough variability going on that I would say that I think it's a reasonable concern. What do you think of all of these pieces kind of moving together and water fluoridation in general?
I would say there's a lot of studies out there that have linked fluoride to lower IQ scores, to initiation of what I would consider what we've seen in Utah, where I think they banned fluoridation of the water now, right? So we're going to see a state-by-state reevaluation of whether or not they want to continue with the fluoride program. Now, I think if we take a step back, right, and look at, I think you guys covered why they initially started the fluoridation point of view. It did lead to increased caries health, reduction in cavities, better oral health in general, right? So there is a huge benefit from that. We often talk about.
So I want to say that there was criticism indicating that at the time that water fluoridation became enacted, and certainly during the pivotal study that moved all the states to want to deploy water fluoridation, there was also a concerted effort to communicate oral hygiene. And so it was a contaminant, if you will, of the day, in that you can't necessarily separate the two benefits,
Chicken and egg, right? Like the
exactly.
Sexual education. Right now, we see a lot less teenage pregnancy, right? We see a lot less teens having sex in general. Now, we've also had COVID and the social media thing. So, like you said, what was the causer? Is this a cofactor? Is this when the moon is in retrograde, people tend to act crazier kind of thing? Is this a coincidence or is this actually something, right?
Right.
No,
Right.
that's a very good point.
But feel free to bring up all the safety studies that we have.
We do have a lot of safety studies. And that's the thing, though. When we do population to population comparisons, right? Like when you do most of these studies, they're smaller studies, hundreds of people to thousands of people, and try to kind of extrapolate to millions and hundreds of millions. You're always going to have a hard time just because of the population difference. And so it is believable that both studies could be true, that when EPA looks at the totality of data and does the analysis, they say, no, we don't see a problem. There's not a problem because there's no change in anything and everything fits in statistically. But when just using statistics, when you look at a smaller study, the signal's a lot bigger, right? Because it's a smaller population.
Absolutely.
So it could be, instead of a linear effect, you're seeing some kind of threshold effect. So, for example, you could say, it doesn't matter. You'll always see 60 people die from exposure to egg whites, right? Because they have egg allergy. So 60 people a year will always die from it. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's a country of 40 million. Doesn't matter if it's a 200,000 people population. You'll always see the 60 because there's a threshold effect. But we don't often think about that in our minds. We often think about something as linear based. So we try to kind of draw the line, at least because that's our...
Or extrapolate and fearmonger, right?
Yes. The fear-mongering is the way of the world. And I would say even 10, 15 years ago, you would hear people in college, I don't want to say smoke in a bowl, but, some of the philosophers you meet in college, and they'd be like, fluoride's a neurotoxin, and they're doing it to make us stupider so they can control us. And to see that now become a real kind of, if not thought process, but somewhat that's believably, or at least charged enough that people are threatened by fluoride, is fascinating. I have this theory, and this is a terrible theory as a scientist, but I do feel, and this is something probably we'll figure out eventually, that art can sometimes or does influence real life, right? But we have seen, or we do see, how the human imagination can often drive things into reality. I mean, when we look at the iPhone, all I can think of is those are those Star Trek things they used to have in the TV show, right? Where they were like talking to their
Yeah,
little things. So, I mean, the imagination of humans is amazing, but it also can, I guess, drive how our emotions feel about things, right? And it doesn't really matter what the science says.
agreed.
Someone said this at a conference and it really resonated. Science will never defeat emotion, right? If people feel something a certain way, you can have all the science backing in the world and you'll still lose the case. And I think about the talc Johnson and Johnson lawsuit recently where, all the science said talc doesn't cause ovarian cancer, and they still had multiple billion-dollar lawsuits that they ended up losing and having to eventually divest their company from. So the science may say one thing, it's just getting people to step beyond their emotions and kind of be willing to listen to that part. That's the hard part, I think. And I think that's a major factor in fluoride, and honestly, probably a major factor in what we're seeing with the reorganization of the HHS and everything else, right?
I think you're right about that. And I think that there are two sides of fear mongering here. We have two camps that are just, one, it's obviously a neurotoxin. We don't want it in our water supply. I don't want it in my toothpaste. But the dentist is like, well, I only have one active that is really meaningful in this space. How can we kind of make a deal?
Mm-hmm.
How can I still deploy this, what I think is a very important oral health drug, in an effective way that will solve the problem for the consumer that doesn't want a high level of exposure? So I guess what I want you to talk about is some of the safety and efficacy around fluoride and how I've talked ad nauseum, I would say, about there's one study, it was only like 2,000 people, but it was out of the VA where they're studying at-risk populations that have high incident of caries, and they tested varnish only versus fluoride toothpaste and rinse, and found that varnish was just as effective. And to me, that signals that we don't have to use it every day to get the efficacy. But then the whole effort around water fluoridation was to have everybody protected. And we know that today we have fewer people with dental coverage. And so it remains an issue getting everybody treated. And so I also kind of want you to talk to us about the potential of having a varnish that's over the counter that is maybe more accessible, or is that a possibility at some point? And just kind of spitballing around what we could do in this area that might be a way to address the safety.
That's a great question. But I'm going to take a step back and talk about efficacy and availability first.
Perfect.
The most effective way to make sure everybody gets a treatment is to put it in a product that everyone uses and no one has to pay extra for. So that's why the effectiveness of adding it to the water supply makes it such an ideal tool for dental health. Having things people have to buy or purchase while giving them the freedom of choice also then can result in things like people not using it, or people getting the wrong idea, or people claiming vaccines cause autism, or that fluoride is.
You just opened up a whole can of worms, by the way.
I figured I should have waited to the end to just drop that and then mic drop and like.
I'm clipping that. That's going to be like the thumbnail.
Amazing. I love that.
But yes, and the reality is that if you make things over the counter, the actual percentage of people who actually are going to get the benefit will drop prodigiously, right? I know, especially right now in the economic kind of world we're facing now, people are making very significant choices about what they choose to purchase. And I can't see people saying, well, I could eat food, or I'm going to buy some varnish so I can fight with my kid to put it on their teeth.
That's a fair point.
And maybe this is me because I have the personal experience of my son needing varnish multiple times. He's a cavity monster. You know, and they do it in the office, right? But I mean, it's not a cheap experience. It's $400,
Right.
$500, right?
Really?
I think it was last time it was, and we showed it to him. It might have been 300, but it was in the multiple hundred range, which
Wow. I must have really good coverage that I didn't really appreciate until just now. Mine's like 25 or 30. So,
that's
yeah,
it.
interesting.
Oh my God, that is
Mhm.
really good. $25, $30. Oh, jeez,
Yeah.
I got the wrong insurance. Uh,
Yeah.
but not everybody's going to be able to afford it. Not everybody has insurance, so the availability of the fluoride in the water is a really good, huge plus on the benefit side, right? You get the benefit of giving it to everybody or most people. You also get the benefit of it not really having an economic cost to the general public outside of normal intake, or at least they don't perceive it as such. It's like I said, the availability, and you do have some kind of net positive effect, right? We know that better dental care aside, we at least correlate that with better health. Now, having said that, if there was a better product, that's a huge mountain it'd have to climb to get over the other things. It'd have to be extremely available. It'd have to be probably ease of use, because right now you don't need a manual to do it. You don't need any instruction that's idiot proof. You live your life and you're going to get fluoride. So to get to a, I guess, corresponding level, there's a lot of activation energy you'd have to achieve to get it. Now, having said that, if the argument is that there's a net negative that we're not perceiving or that fluoride is causing, and we need to go to a different, I'll use the term tool to combat dental caries and improve oral health or maintain the oral health we have now, then we should see it in the data, I would think. And that's, I think, been one of the obstacles. I know they've tried to link it to IQ and as a neurotoxin, but I think how IQ tests go, right? They're generally not prescribed for those kinds of studies, and generally are designed to work a certain way that's been extrapolated to an unintended use, in which normally isn't, as effective or as useful.
Right. I appreciate you bringing that up because one of the criticism has been the variability on the IQ test, and the reduction isn't necessarily clearly meaningful, i.e., real.
Mm.
So I do think that that is a huge caveat to what we're talking about here, and the host of potential other environmental issues that could be participating in this. So it's a messy, unclear subject. And when we go back to the animal data of applicable doses, and I want to underscore the applicable dose part, we don't see really any significant signal of concern. And so I would say it's easy to have feelings around possibly being stupider for using toothpaste, or or conversely stripped of everything because it's our only real active.
Mm.
So I think it's just a hot button issue, which brings me to, we do have some other tools, although none of them have really made it through FDA clearance because the hurdle's so high. And so when we talk about other alternatives like the proxy hydroxyapatite, for example,
Mm-hmm.
why is that not as effective? Do you know, as a toxicologist, why is it not quite as robust as fluoride?
No idea.
I mean, it's just calcium. I think that
But
fluoride,
I'll spitball a bit.
yeah, perfect.
So I think the effectiveness is different because you're essentially trying to create an artificial version of the enamel to kind of fill in the gaps over the two surface where the normal enamel has been worn away or decreased. But it doesn't necessarily, I guess, deal with a direct issue. It's more of a preventative kind of papering over, if you will. We're not exactly removing or binding the antagonist to the teeth, the enamel itself, right? We're trying to initiate, I guess, a filler. So I want to say like a composite of different materials. So both the functional real and then the additional extra enamel. That is, it's not quite a varnish, but it's not exactly, I would think, resolving the issue directly. So I could see that being one obstacle, even though it sounds great because it has the natural kind of idea, right? The
Right.
biomimicry, right? Where you're essentially recreating what's already in the mouth to a certain extent.
You don't think it's a competitive issue that fluoride is just more efficient?
I do think it's more efficient, but I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. I think it's always better to treat the disease, not the symptom of the disease, if that makes sense, right?
Sure, absolutely. Mhm. But I mean, if we're using it in kids, it's a prophylactic of
Hmm.
sorts, right? Because for kids, it's just strengthening the enamel so that they're more resilient.
Right.
But in adults, we're using it to treat the disease. So you're thinking maybe come in and address the bacteria or the food
Right.
products.
Yes. And you guys know this. 90% of it is the mechanical, the actual just brushing and getting rid of the physical debris and removing it from the oral cavity, right? So it's not necessarily, the chemical fluoride is a nice add-on, but it's really the functional of let's just not leave this lying around in our mouth to grow bacteria and release materials that damage the enamel and other parts of the gums, right? So,
Right. I think about this all the time where our saliva quality, we just had a nice conversation about the quality of saliva. So it's not always just the bacteria, it's not always our food products, it could just be our saliva quality. And I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of meaningful ways to address saliva quality, but I could see that being another way. If you
definitely.
have anything to weigh in on that as somebody who's bathing in chemistry every day.
Well, honestly, was thinking about it in terms of something very similar, nitrous oxide. I was thinking about how
Hmm.
that's kind of considered the key to a lot of different aspects of health. And people are like, well, if your nitric oxide goes down or the enzyme that creates it deregulates your thing. But to me, that's always like, it's again one of our failings as a human. We always look for the one simple answer, like, oh, it's this, it's the one thing, like, it's sugar, no, it's fats, no, it's trans fats, no, it's ultra processed food, so so
The more we learn, the
yeah,
more messed up we get on everything.
yeah. So I think it's saliva, and I think it's one of those things where we're still learning. I
Yeah.
saw something, and I think you probably have talked about this, and you guys got me a bit interested in this in the oral microbiome, because previously I've been very into the gut microbiome and its facility, and it's kind of
But it starts in your mouth.
yes, but also how it interacts with so many different systems in the body to regulate anything. And it's like, oh, people used to say your heart controls you, but in reality, is it really your gut? And your gut's really the control point, but it controls it in a different way than we think about the brain and the thing. Kind of like the
Well, kind of,
yeah,
because our bacteria can produce,
yes,
all sorts of signals for the brain to shift moods, and I love that.
yeah.
Wild
We are
combination.
a big organism with billions of organisms within us that control us. So, I mean, I hate to say it, think of it like the ant colony with the queen and the different drones and all that, but it is a bit
Our
like that in
feelings
our
are
body.
actually theirs.
Yes, yes,
They're having feelings and we just emote them for them.
yes. Inside Out 2 style, yes. Lots of anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, there has to be a probiotic for that now, right?
I thought it was melatonin. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure the bacteria produce that too. No, the nitric oxide story is interesting. I
Yeah.
This is a personal aside, but I just found out I had this really weird genetic profile where I can't make alpha-1 antitrypsin.
Wait, what?
Yeah, and, so I can't clear inflammation very efficiently, and so the way that my body becomes efficient at releasing nitric oxide is through my lungs. So apparently,
Mhm.
people with my deficiency just exhale a whole lot of nitric oxide, but my salivary levels are very low.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because my body has become, I probably am butchering this, but more efficient at excreting it through my pulmonary system. In any case, I think that's why my salivary fit strips will come up as very low, is just because this weird genetic trait that I have. But that just speaks to how individualized we all are. And so there's a reason probably why I have always had gingivitis, not necessarily my microbiome, but my genetic backdrop flavors my system. You know, we all have unique things about ourselves that we have to treat differently. Like, for example, I'm working with a fitness trainer right now, and he's recommending, chicken all the time because it's got a low fat content,
Mm-hmm.
high protein, right? Amazing. My gut hates it. I can only eat it like every other day, maybe, and still,
When you
chicken.
say your
Who would
gut
know?
hates it, what do you mean? Like it sends messages to your
Distress.
brain, or you got a GI distress? Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's
now that we've gone all the way there, it has nothing to do with fluoride, but I do think that, all of us have different issues, and not everybody's going to have a cavity issue
mm-hmm.
or a gingivitis issue. And so again, like, I think that water fluoridation, while well-meaning, I think I'm not afraid to back that off. I just wish that there were other options for people who do need some coverage that is meaningful, that can't access our systems necessarily.
Hmm. Do you guys think that there is a cry out for increased oral health as a public health concern?
Yes.
Ooh, I think so. Whether or not people are aware their cry outs include oral health,
Mm-hmm.
I think is a whole nother discussion. But I think we do live in a day and age, I think it was really accelerated from the pandemic of both personalized and systemic changes to how we go about caring for ourselves and having autonomy
Mm-hmm.
or agency, and being able to at least let that awareness guide to outcomes and results.
I was thinking of it from the oral health perspective, in that, like, at Dentech this last year, there were people kind of had been consulting from the FDA point of view, along with the ADA and many large companies in the oral health space, talking about how impossible the regulations are, and that if fluoride's off the table, or if people are becoming leery of using
Mm-hmm.
fluoride, then they really need to get a handle on the fact that the regulations are so cost prohibitive,
Mm-hmm.
because we really need alternative innovations, and there's no clear path that isn't outrageously expensive, cost prohibitive. So that is a huge cry out from the oral health community itself in every layer.
Well, I have to say, when I think of this fluoride issue, it reminds me of the aluminum issue, right? Are you guys familiar with aluminum? And
No, tell us
okay,
the story.
so a few years ago, there was a great outcry about aluminum and its connection to breast cancer, to the point where people started pointing out that aluminum was a big part of deodorants, to the point where it ended up disrupting the industry as a whole, because companies became very aware of this feedback of a local, I would say, population. I don't know how big, if it was a majority, probably not. But there was this connection people were making, and it spread like wildfire on social media. And it was like, I don't use deodorant or antiperspirant because it causes breast cancer, or aluminum is bad, even though all the data shows that the aluminum was not passing through the skin, unless you had to totally rip your underarms or whatever part of your body and you had an open gaping wound, you weren't getting any aluminum in your body. So, it wasn't causing cancer. But the emotion overswelled the data. And so all these companies jumped out of using it, and they were disrupted. Small companies started saying, look, we're aluminum free, aluminum free, aluminum free. And you saw the paradigm shift where companies had to change their formulas, but the net result was a less effective antiperspirant, which, I kind of analogize to the fluoride situation we're in, right? if we are going to get out of it, we need to have a better or fundamentally at least equivalent solution, because otherwise we're just going to lose the benefit and we may see an increase in another adverse outcome down the road that's significant or that could have been avoided. And that's always what I think about, especially in circumstances where the data does seem to be at best middling or equivocal, right? We need to have a real idea of what's next before we jump out.
Absolutely.
Right? Mm-hmm. Especially if we can't show there's an acute cliff we're running towards. I don't know that. I mean, we've been using fluoride for 40, 60 years now, for the most part. And as you mentioned, there's many places where natural fluoride levels are high and people have been using them. We do need to define what is the issue so we can avoid it if it's there, but also what's the next step? What's the alternative? Like you said, it has to be cost effective. It can't be cost prohibitive, because especially with how we are now, we don't want just billionaires to have access to the good hygiene, right?
Yeah, exactly. Although it feels like that's the case for everything.
Yeah. Well, their yachts need yachts. I mean, what can you say?
That's another episode. And maybe not this podcast. Boy.
We'll do that on the Billionaires podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Billionaire Boys podcast.
Outrageous personalized medicine for your mouth. I'm on it.
Yes. It does make me think of that guy. They did that huge article about that guy last year. He's a very rich person who takes blood from his son so he can remain young. And he was like, "Look, I have the body of a 20-year, but you still look like you're 65." I don't know what to tell you.
That is so wild. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's right up there with our first president, who had teeth from his slaves, right?
The enslaved people, yes.
Yes. So there's always ways to get innovative by using other people's goods, I guess. That's a dark path.
Yes.
But, we're here for it. We cover everything.
What's that old saying by Jonathan Swift? Eat the poor. The poor seller fits to the rich to eat, and then there won't be poor anymore.
Oh, is that okay? There we go.
I mean,
there we go.
It's an allegory, but still.
It feels real life today. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's always been that way. The kids in the mine and the kids in the army. By kids, anybody. Your kids go to war, my kids get my bone spurs. Sorry. No president or past or future is being referred to.
Amazing. Jonathan, you want to weigh in on this?
He's like, no, I don't. Out. We've gone too far.
Couldn't say it better than me, Craig.
Nothing's off topic here, friends.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
I do think, though, we're not that far off from the statement that fluoride, in the water is one of the great innovations of the modern life, to now fluoride is making us all dumber and killing our children, or whatever someone's going to say.
It's inevitable. I mean, there's some parallels with, say, discussions with vaccines right now.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
To me, the data is undeniable, or the evidence is undeniable of how much of a public global benefit vaccination programs are for mitigating and preventing certain diseases outcomes. And yet what has been a flaring and, dare I say, controversial conversation lately, getting back to the autism part, right?
Mm-hmm. A study that's been pulled back, shown to be falsified and everything. And yet still that's, if you polled a certain number of people, non-zero population would say, yes, vaccines cause autism. But it also shows, I mean, we have our head of our HHS saying things about autism that are clearly not true. So, it is one of those things where the emotion continues to take the wheel for our policies. And we see that in California with the legislature, with that EPA lawsuit you mentioned around fluoride, with the banning of certain chemicals. I'm thinking of some of the colorants where the data shows that there's no issue, but still we're banning it because...
It's emotion with agendas.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And I don't want to give air to any of the people who make cotton industries of it, but people have shown that they can do it for profit and fearmonger. It's funny enough. Funny. Speaking of the pandemic, did you ever see that movie Contagion?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
It's hard to watch now after the actual pandemic, but I think about Jude Law's character in it. Right? He's like, "Oh, I have the cure," and and it turns out he was lying and never had it at all. So I don't know who he's supposed to represent, but that's a very. It's not hard to see people enacting things like that for fun and profit, as they say.
So, to go and review kind of all the things that we've talked about and maybe just a couple other hot items on the list, I wanted to kind of summarize some of the things that we discussed. One of which was that women in pregnancy with their kids paired for fluoride intake and urine output and IQ. And so I wanted to just kind of systematically go through some of the key points in these studies. There's two of them that are most referenced, and that is Mexico and Canada. And for this discussion, we're just going to focus on Canada because the Mexico study was a very weak study. The Canadian one was a prospective study that really, went in with the goals of examining this fluoride issue. And so when we look granularly at the data, we're seeing that intake of fluoride in non-fluoridated versus fluoridated areas in the mothers is a little lower in the unfluoridated, but not none. But Craig, tell us the problem with the intake, the fluoride intake data.
I think it's an interesting study, but it runs into, I think, one of the major issues we generally have with epidemiology studies. It's hard to know if there's other cofactors involved. It's hard to know how they are collecting the data because it's for one of the better words, we it's not like an animal study where you can control what they're actually intaking and you can measure down to the molecule basically what they're
Right. So
being
did they,
exposed to. So
it
and
doesn't
and this
appear
study,
that they measured the fluoride in the water. They just, how did
right.
they measure it?
And what they did, according to their methods, is they did a questionnaire during the first and third trimesters of the pregnancy for the mothers, and basically estimated based on the amount of self-reported water, tea, and coffee the participants were drinking. So there is a bit of uncertainty there that we can't really understand, right? Um, I mean, you can estimate kind of what someone's drinking, but you don't know if there's some variance not only in like the fluoride amount per drink, but in generally in the kind of like the amount they're taking. So I mean, we've all done these surveys. Someone and you say, oh, how much did you drink? Maybe I drank three. Well, maybe you really drank two, but you just don't remember, or maybe you drank four. So I mean, there's a lot of kind of things that makes it kind of hard to have a real pin down. And then of course I think like you were saying there could be several cofactors involved in seeing whether or not especially a test result which has some variance. I believe they mentioned that they saw some variance in some of the boys, and then the boys but also if they tested the boys at a different time they would see a 5 point variance or change in the original test score. So it's hard to say whether what they're seeing is a real thing or if it just happened to be statistically significant or if there was a real biological effect, right? And when we all know this too, I mean, it's not really an IQ test per se. It's more of a pattern recognition test, and there could be some slight differences just on the populations they were studied just by happenstance. So it's
Mm.
hard to tell. I mean, if we dug into if there was a bigger biological significance or uh, signal, it might be easier to make a judgment, but I think that if the average was like 3 points, that's not huge.
Right. Well, so I wanted to first touch on the kind of daily intake for CDC recommendations is zero point 0.3 to 1.2 mg per liter. And in the study, both the unfluoridated and fluoridated populations reported similar intakes.
Hmm.
And then their excretion via urine is expected to be between zero point 0.3 and 1.2. And both groups fell into those ranges as well. So to me, it looks like a wash as far as importance. Like we've already kind of established that these ranges were safe and are safe. And if we are looking at the IQ, the significance was only in the group of boys. We didn't see it in the girls for this study. And it was a 3-point decrease. And it is known that boys just testing, if I were a boy and just taking a test day to day, I could vary by 5 points. So it's hard to really take their 3-point decrease with any weight, considering that we do know that there is a variance, and IQ can change over time as well.
Right. That's a good point. It is. I mean, we IQ is one of those buzzwords, right? Or
Yeah,
things that third rail that people really like to focus on because of a perceived connection to population genetics. But it
right.
it really isn't clear that there's any difference between for of 3 points between a person, uh, especially in the middle of the IQ spectrum versus, maybe at the bottom end there would be there's a big difference between three.
I could tell you that, day by day, there are moments where I'm like, wow, I must have dropped off a cliff because I'm not really tracking today. And I think that we can all relate to that, right?
Right.
Hopefully.
But but like you said, it can vary day to day, right? Some days you're the smartest person in
Yeah,
the world. Some days you're just like, God, did I put on my shoes the right way? Am I wearing the right on the right foot and the left on the left foot?
exactly. Exactly. And then aren't we putting importance on EQ now, right? That's a thing.
Yes, that is definitely a thing. One of the probably most important things. So I mean,
Yeah,
it's all just, I guess, designed to figure out and quantify in a easy to digest way why people are successful, and it really
right.
is just, what do you call it, snake oil, in my opinion.
Yes.
But
Well,
that's
I do want to say that I did appreciate this study's kind of attempt to harmonize all of the factors. They really did look at, unfluoridated versus fluoridated. They normalized the socioeconomic backdrop. They tested other environmental factors. I mean, they really did try to do a meaningful study here, and I very much appreciate their due diligence.
I agree, and it just shows how hard it is to do all this stuff, right? Because even
Yeah.
with all that, we could still, there's so many things we have questions about, and like, oh, we could spend years trying to dig down into some of this stuff. So yeah.
Right, exactly. And so I think those are all important pieces, and we can only improve from here. They did a really nice start. Could we go further? Yes. So another piece that I hadn't brought up yet, but I think it only deserves like a minute of airtime, is that people have been bringing up other fluoride exposure opportunities. Like, okay, we know environment plays a role, but pharmaceutical compounds are another place where we are exposed to fluorine or fluoride components. So we see this in Prozac, ciprofloxacin, other antivirals, corticosteroids, NSAIDs. You know, it's been utilized in pharmacology for many, many, many years. But all of these are fluoride compounds that are chemically bound to other chemical structures. And so it's not a free fluoride like we see in water and in toothpaste. And so it has a very different pathway. So basically, how we get rid of these compounds in our bodies is that it goes through the renal pathway. So the fluoride has to be decoupled there and then is strictly excreted. And so I don't see a role. Now, just briefly, the benefit to putting these fluoride fluorine compounds in pharmaceutical agents is because it can extend the half-life of the drug, make it more stable. So again, it lasts longer. It can improve the potency. In any case, So once it's gone into the renal system, toxicologist Craig, do we expect it to float back into our system and cause more ruckus? Or is it like, are we safe there? Or is this a place where I should be considering fluoride exposure?
I think generally it's a great question. And I think generally I would say it's going to depend on what the actual drug is for and what the risk benefit is, right? So if you have cancer, I think fluoride levels are probably the least of your like concerns
True,
at the time.
true.
You know, you're going to be looking to hopefully, God willing, recover and destabilize the cancer and recover and live a long life afterward, or live as healthy as you can. If it's something else, like maybe, for example, there's fluoride is a key component of an antifungal, and if you use it for more than 4 months, they've shown that it does appear in your bloodstream. So is that
Interesting.
something where you're like, hey, okay, this is maybe something you should be concerned about, right?
Well, it
Um,
depends on my fungal infection because those can kill you too. So,
they can. But hopefully I think it's over the counter, but hopefully it's not so bad that it's going to kill you. But yeah, that's a great question, right?
interesting. Okay.
Is there enough fluoride in the I would say in the general population, it's probably not something you would need to worry about. Though, as fluoride is present in things like statins and uh, other things that we are, as a growing older population, are taking more and more of. But
I
in
see.
general, since fluoride, the major concern around fluoride is with children, and once you get to a certain age, your IQ is I don't want to say it's static, but it's pretty much established where it's going to be. It's less of a concern. So I don't think at least for the vulnerable populations we're generally concerned about. This is not like a major contributor, if that makes sense. So I agree with
Yeah,
your
I
assessment.
appreciate that. Okay. So holistically, we're thinking probably fine, except for, just ongoing potential exposure with certain drugs, maybe.
Yes.
Um, Excellent. So taking that off the table for the most part, I think the last kind of roundup item that I wanted to touch on was alternatives. So hydroxyapatite has come up as an alternative, and I don't think that there are any safety studies of issue. Like, I don't think it's popping up as a concern. It is part of our natural system of it's in our bones and teeth. And so, the biomimicry aspect is appealing, but it certainly isn't as efficient at remineralizing as something like fluoride that has a higher affinity towards calcium. Um, and so I think it's appealing, but I wanted to kind of call out some of the watch outs with regard to clinical trials. And maybe you can kind of help me think through this. So we know that fluoride is tricky to formulate, to make sure that it has a bioavailability element. And so, too, is hydroxyapatite. So, bioavailability is a huge issue in formulation. And some companies are smaller, they don't have maybe the awareness or even the due diligence to really control for the bioavailability in their products. When we're looking at clinical trials, oftentimes we're doing kind of a comparison to see if this toothpaste is equivalent to that toothpaste. But if both toothpastes have formulation issues and you're unaware of it, then you could have no change and no change and say, oh, they're both as efficacious. And you would never know that neither of them are doing anything because you don't have the right controls. And so there's just all of these elements to a clinical trial that I wanted to bring forward as factors. Now, if you could speak to some of that.
I think that's an excellent point to raise, and I think you touched on it kind of at the beginning when you said the idea is we don't have as much clinical information. Like I think you said 70 years of data, safety data on fluoride and its use, we don't have the same expansive, information about hydroxyapatite.
Hydroxyapatite. I
Sorry,
know it's such a big
mouthful.
word.
But we I mean, we do know that it's present in our body, but at the same time, there's a difference between what we're actually applying artificially, right? Because there's a difference in particle size, there's some difference in uniformity. We don't. It's not all the same thing because it's not as old or as established as the fluoride industry is, right? So that makes it harder. The other question or thought is, we don't know if the biomimicry works at a threshold base, or if there's a kind of linear relationship, or even what's worse is if we can get in too much hydroxyapatite. Like, what's the limit that's going to cause some alterations, some bad alterations in the enamel, right? You can't open your mouth because everything's now it's attached to it. I mean, I'm joking, obviously, but
I do think that potentially there's a threshold uptake issue. So again, like we see this in all of pharmacology where you have a threshold of benefit and it just maxes out because your body just cannot do more. So there's a specific reaction that's happening in your mouth during the remineralization process that you're trying to help and take advantage of. And, you could put just pure fluoride in your mouth and you're going to max out a benefit. And
mm,
so this is another thing. I mean, I thank you for bringing that up. This is another kind of interesting thought process where when we submit clinical trials, we have to kind of ethically talk through our examination process so that it gets past the IRB, which is basically an ethics review board, saying, yeah, that sounds like a safe, non-harmful way to examine your problem. And so with fluorides, well, with all of oral care, fluoride has such a safety profile that you almost can't do a meaningful study without having fluoride in both groups. Like they don't want to see a non-fluoride group because they think that's unethical. So one of the things that we do to override that system is have those two fluoride groups, but one of them is fluoride plus the thing you're testing to see if you
mm,
get an added benefit. But yet, if you're at a threshold,
mm,
then you're not going to see more benefit. You're just going to see equivalence, maybe. And so there's those confounding factors of just running a trial to examine the process in the first place. And so things like hydroxyapatite, adding that to a fluoride toothpaste, is that better? Is it bioavailable? Is it all of the questions, remain. So again, like having 70 years of data is appealing because we have so much to pull from, and we know that it is in the environment, always has been, and that it hasn't killed us. The other thing I do want to kind of give a head nod to, and that is that the white spot lesions that indicate we've had too much fluoride,
mm,
dental fluorosis, we call it, and that there
mhm,
is the possibility of skeletal fluorosis because, of course, if it's showing up in our teeth, it might show up in our bones. Um, this is a last kind of summary issue. And so that dental fluorosis has been increasing over time, reporting in from the CDC. And what that means for our bones is potential for increased fractures as we get older,
mhm,
because we could assume that there's some brittle bones happening. And there have been studies from my assessment. The last review I read on this subject, 10 studies were showing, yes, this is true. We do see more fractures um, over time, possibly related to that fluorosis issue. And then 7 studies showing, no, we don't see that. And
mm,
so again, these are big, large studies trying to get a handle on the population-based approach, which is tricky, as we just kind of reviewed with the urine study. So, I mean, but those factors aren't aren't affecting your neurology. They're not affecting your metabolism. Could we explore those issues further? Sure. But I don't think that there's enough evidence to show that fluoride exposure is a major concern in those areas. Maybe it's a minor concern, potentially.
Yeah.
And certainly we could do more. But, if you have any thoughts on that.
I think, and I tend to be on the hesitant side, or the conservative side, with
Yeah.
new compounds or alternatives, especially when the idea is to go cold turkey from one well-known and well-used kind of chemical to another, just because I've just seen too many times where you get the experience of and I'll use a terrible idiom, jumping the fishes out of the frying pan and into the fire kind of thing, where you
Right.
said, oh, we got to get out of this. And you're in such a hurry to get out of it. You end up in something that has an unintended consequence that could potentially be worse. Not saying that's this case, but it does mean we need to do the due diligence, right? We need to
Right.
find the studies, do the research, make it more open, so at least the science can lead the way in terms of what's actually going on, and determining if the risk benefit is close enough to fluoride, and whether that's decreased risk and maybe slightly less benefit, or even more benefit and about the same risk, for to get rid of or to move out of the fluoride space, right? Um, and it's hard though, because I mean, at least right now, there's a bit of the doubt in scientists as a whole and science as a function.
Yeah.
So it's just part of an ongoing larger project. So we have to just be more transparent and more clear what the goal is, right? And make sure we it's understanding that we're trying to make something that's going to be beneficial to people. We're not trying to hurt people or make money off people by hurting them, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
But there's definitely a market for the alternative to fluoride, and I think you know that very well, right, Camille?
I do think, in every therapeutic area, we like to have options because a one and done approach is almost never effective. And so the fact that we've been hanging our hats on fluoride for close to 100 years is just not, it's first, not a good look.
Hmm.
And second, like, it just shows that we have been poorly innovative in this area. And I don't actually think that that's true. I think that the regulatory pathway for oral care is just really hard.
Mm.
And it's too costly for most of industry to move forward. And it's been a huge problem. So I'm hoping that the regulatory landscape can shift to our benefit soon. That said, I don't look, aspirin, how old is aspirin? And we still rely on it,
Right.
and yet we know that there's some issues with it, and we're taking advantage of those issues by understanding it better. So I think we can only improve our usage here. I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Right. Yes.
I think we can learn and make better, improve how we use our tools moving forward. So again, I love the pragmatic approach and just being really mindful. And I appreciate your kind of catering to all of the factors that are playing a role here. I surprised me in some ways to think about some of the pieces that you brought forward. And so I really appreciate you being with us today. I like to land on a more fun topic. So, like, is there anything you've been reading lately that we could take note of?
Ah, that I could take note of.
It could
Jeez.
be fun. It could be a comic or a movie that you've seen.
What did I just? I just finished a probably 30-year-old book by Gore Vidal about the founding fathers, and it's 150 pages, so light read. But it took me maybe 2 months to finish it, just because it's one of those things where you start reading, you're just like, oh, I gotta sit back and kind of digest
Yeah.
this, because he talks about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and everything that was going on and kind of the scuttlebutt of the time, and you think, oh, this is not what you learn about in schools, more or less. But it humanizes a lot of the founding fathers. And then it ends with a great quote, because I guess Gore Vidal was very friendly with the Kennedys, so he's hanging out with them at their compound, and he's talking about thing, and John F. Kennedy, the one that was president, is going, "These people must have been special, they were just amazing people." And Gore Vidal's kind of human, and he's like, "But I mean, how else could they come up with all this stuff?" And Gore Vidal's thinking, George Washington didn't win a battle until the last one during the war, and the only reason he was probably the general was because he was 6'5" and everybody else was 5'10". You know what I mean? Just weird genetic coincidences. And then how all like different members of the early thing were all spies for like different countries. So Jefferson was basically a spy for the French, and Adams was basically a spy for the English. So stuff like that.
Some things never change, I think.
Yes, some things never change. 100%.
I recommended this book, The Fourth Turning, to like all my friends. Somebody recommended it to me. But similarly, it's not the founding fathers, but it is kind of speaking to the rise and fall of nations and the key points where there's a socio shift in the culture and kind of how the generations each give rise to it. But to your point of like having to sit back and digest it, it has taken me a very long time to get through the book, but it's been a fun journey. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on the pod to help us map through this wild fluoride moment. I'm sure we'll be talking about it for quite some time as we puzzle through kind of next steps for oral health and what that might look like. But thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. A long-time listener, first-time caller.
Hey, love to hear that. It's always a pleasure, Craig.
Thank you.
All right, until next time.
Let's get oral.
So, sorry, was I talking?
I was about to ask, actually.